at civilian infrastructure or into some territory in Rostov region or whatever. That's Pavlov Kovalchuk. Had Putin got any choice but to do something after the Duma also voted for him to recognize the independent republics?
Well, my take on this is that there's two camps. I mean, those that believe that Putin doesn't believe Ukraine is a real country and that he's hell-bent on destroying it, that he feels that democracy there is threatening him. And then those who think that Putin is what it says on the can. It's about security concerns, that he's afraid of eventual missiles in Ukraine, and those would be on the border. They would have under 5-minute flight times, and they would be able to hit 80% of Russia's population. And although nobody's offering Ukraine membership of NATO at the moment, you know, it could happen eventually. And he's looking to once and for all fix this. And so this has resulted in a game of chicken, if you like, in so much as he made those demands in the round of diplomacy that started in January, a relatively civilized round, and got a flat no from the West. But he's not going to let this go. I mean, for him, this is an essential security question, and he wants to have it resolved. And so the obvious thing to do is escalate. And that's what we've just seen. If he's getting a flat no, then he's going to restart the conversation. But by significantly of NATO at the moment, you know, it could happen eventually. And he's looking to once and for all fix this. And so this has resulted in a game of chicken, if you like, in so much as he made those demands in the round of diplomacy that started in January, a relatively civilized round, and got a flat no from the West. But he's not going to let this go. I mean, for him, this is an essential that Russia would push back if NATO continued to expand, and it did. So then he started modernizing the army in 2012. He sacrificed the prosperity Russia had built up during the boom years for this effort and built up, what is it, $630 billion of reserves. It's an insanely huge amount of money, paid off the debt, so Russia is one of the lowest debts, and made the whole economy sanction-proof. And he's going to go all the way because there's very little leverage. I mean, harsh sanctions are coming, but I don't believe they're actually going to hurt the economy in any significant way. They'll raise costs, they keep growth low, but he's prepared to do all of that because he's totally focused on solving this security issue. Because, you know, agree with him or not, he has a bee in his bonnet about NATO expansion and the threat that poses. And so he's decided to do something about that. That's the reality. We have to deal with a Putin that thinks like that. And I think engage and come to some sort of deal. But it's come down to a fight between his pragmatic security concerns versus principle on Europe's side about the sovereignty of nations being able to choose who their partners are and feeling threatened by Russia, which is threatening. I mean, what he's doing is extremely aggressive. This is the most serious crisis I think the West has faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62.
Well, all that shoring up of the sovereign wealth fund will come as a surprise given the inequality to the poor of Russia, obviously, given the rise of inequality in Russia over the same period, arguably. Do you think I mean, you alluded to Russia not getting a fair hearing. Do you think when Zelensky, who had previously been telling Biden and NATO leaders stop causing panic to the Ukrainian economy, do you think when he started talking about nuclear weapons positioning in Ukraine, that was the last straw for Putin?
I think the last straw was when Macron and Scholz, during this European effort that's been going on in February, both went to Zelensky and told him, look, you need to do the Minsk II agreement. That would solve everything. And moreover, you need to do it on the terms that Russia wants, and that would be to make Donbass, you know, an autonomous region, which gives Russia a de facto veto over NATO. And Zelensky flatly refused to do that. Moreover, called the Minsk II agreements vapid and a waste of time. And I think that was the point where Putin saw that particular possibility of getting Minsk II implemented, because he clearly told Scholz and Macron that if you get Minsk II implemented, then that will solve it. We'll be happy. We'll go away. You know, withdraw from the Donbass, stop interfering. But that didn't happen. And that meeting at the end of last week, where Zelensky made it clear that he wasn't going to budge on that question, then the next day, all of the problems in Donbass flared up. And clearly the Kremlin has been planning this. So the Duma vote, in order to recognize the two republics, this is a card that's been prepared and was played, and they put Putin in a position to make the decision that he's just made. And I think that they've planned out the whole diplomatic effort very carefully, well in advance. So it started with the demands in December, and then you had January round of diplomacy, which was largely focused on the US, hoping that Biden would be able to push this through. When that failed, then you had the European round that focused on Minsk II. But I think last week, Zelensky definitively shut that off and said, we're not going to do it.
Why would he? I mean, unless Ukraine is run like the comedy series that Zelensky was in, showing Ukraine to be an utterly corrupt oligarch-run horrible country of conspiracy. Unless it's like Zelensky's comedy series, why would Zelensky do this to his own country then?
What, you mean give up the Donbass?
No, why would he not abide by the Minsk agreements?
It's a horrible deal. I mean, you're asking Kiev to basically give up any control over one of the regions. I mean, it becomes autonomous. And then if there's a vote for NATO accession membership, then Donbass effectively gets a veto. And quite clearly with, the 700,000 passports that Russia's handed out, half the population of that region, Russia is effectively in control of it. And so you give up the ability to make these decisions like NATO accession, which is in, the aspiration to join NATO is now in the constitution as a national aspiration in the basic law. And then to give up the power to be able to fulfill that by basically giving control of that region to Russia, although nominally it stays inside Ukraine, I think is something that no government would accept.
Well, it was voted for at the UN Security Council by Britain, Russia, France, and China, obviously.
Poroshenko signed the deal. I mean, that's the problem. It's the Ukrainian side signed off on it, agreed to do it. But then Poroshenko himself, when subsequently he resisted at every stage actually implementing it. I mean, it was forced on him by Merkel and Hollande in 2014 to end the fighting that was going on in Donbass. And to that extent, it worked, in so much as the fighting died down. It's just been a sort of frozen conflict, although people keep dying. But it wasn't a hot conflict in the way that it was. I mean, it was, proper open warfare in those days. And now it's just this frozen conflict. So it's a sort of lose-lose situation with the Minsk II, that it helped bring the fighting down, but at the same time, it's not an appealing solution for Kiev, that they don't want to do it. And moreover, people in Kiev say that should Zelensky try and push it through, there would be mass protests. It would also kill his own career. He's facing election later this year. And it's a political suicide to try and push that deal through. So it's really a bad deal. But as I said, it was the only thing on the table. It was a solution, a peaceful solution. But Zelensky's ruled it out, and I think quite understandably. But then Putin's reacted, because the upshot of that decision is Putin takes it to the next stage, which is not quite the invasion, the war that everyone's been talking about, but it's certainly gone well beyond diplomacy, the regular sitting around and negotiating.
Are there parallels, and I should just say, obviously London, Moscow and Washington do support Minsk II, still, even Moscow, parallels with the recognition of Kosovo, which Russia has always criticized, that kicked off the Yugoslav war, in that Kosovo was just unilaterally recognized? Russia is now as bad as Western Europe?
Well, I think so. I mean, look, one of the points here, one of the basic problems is that, you have geopolitics going on where big countries tell little countries what to do. And then you've got the principle, the Helsinki process, where sovereign states have a guaranteed right to make the decisions for themselves. And we all live in a civilized world and should respect that. And the Russians, I think, feel there's a certain amount of hypocrisy here. I mean, Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, brought up the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that was very clearly, you had a sovereign nation, Cuba, deciding to ally with its friend, the Soviet Union, and accept missiles onto its territory. And JFK just was like, no, we're not accepting that. It threatens US security. And so the whole Cuban Missile Crisis thing started. And Putin's arguing that what's going on with Ukraine is exactly the same. That you've got Ukraine that's being used as an unsinkable aircraft carrier moored along the shores of Russia that's going to be a permanent threat. And so big powers, and the way they dress it up is that no two nations can do a security deal if that threatens the security of a third country, in this case, Russia. And that's their argument. But then we've come back saying, look, well, international politics has changed, and it has. And the Helsinki process means that you should respect the sovereign right of a country like Ukraine to do a military alliance with whoever it wants to without any interference. And so there's a basic argument.
I think Russia's obviously going to look at Honduras and Haiti and Venezuela and Syria and...
Isn't this the irony is that the West, I mean, Kosovo was an example, and it is big powers deciding what little powers do. So that's still the way the world works when it suits us. And when it doesn't, then we come with the principles and dig our heels in. And the other point here is that the West feels that, you know, it's economically and militarily superior to Russia, so that it doesn't need to be pushed around. But the problem with that is that Putin is extremely talented at making trouble. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, Biden was trying to get rid of the Russia problem to focus on China. And what's happened, like his entire foreign policy has been captured by Russia, and his entire foreign policy effort is now totally consumed with dealing with Russia. So Putin's had a victory already, in so much as that he's put this agenda on the table, and Biden can't ignore it, and it's not going away. And the people in Europe are seriously worried about having a war in their backyard, which they really don't want.
Well, people in Europe that you speak of just seem to just support Washington all the way through, and whether it's Biden or Jake Sullivan or Anthony Blinken, I suppose, is a different matter. And I suppose the propaganda war now is all about the fact Russia has also broken its agreement to the Budapest agreement that it made over Ukraine and respecting Ukrainian sovereignty.
Isn't that why Zelensky brought up nuclear weapons? And so much as part of that agreement was that Ukraine agreed to give up its weapons under the Budapest in return for a territorial guarantee by Russia. And what Zelensky was saying there is that Russia's then ignored that guarantee it gave, that's enshrined in the Budapest memo. And so Zelensky's saying, well, if you're going to ignore your part of it, then we'll ignore our part of it and rearm with nuclear weapons. It's a threat and a criticism.
Ben Aris, I'll stop you there. More from Eastern European specialist and editor-in-chief of BNE Intelli News after this break.
While visiting Poland, Joe Biden said out loud what many in Russia have long believed. NATO eastward expansion has always been about forced regime change in Russia, and Ukraine has been at the center of that strategy. When people tell you who they are, believe them.
Welcome back. I'm still here with Ben Aris, Eastern European specialist and editor-in-chief of BNE Intelli News. Now, on to the actual sanctions announced by the British government, some of them just following entities that are already sanctioned by the United States. Some may ask, why did they not sanction them earlier if the US was sanctioning them? Who is Gennady Timchenko of the Volga Group? I understand they have a 23% stake in Novatex, Russia's second largest gas producer, construction. They own a rail company, timber, infrastructure projects. It's obviously going to affect many workers in Russia. What's it going to mean to him and Boris Rottenberg and his nephew Igor of SMP Bank?
They're Russia's biggest oligarchs, and moreover, they belong to the Putin circle, the intimate inner circle. They've known Putin since they were all in St. Petersburg, young men, and have grown up together. And that when Putin came to power, the first thing he did in the first year, he had this famous oligarch meeting and pushed all the oligarchs out of the Kremlin. Except these oligarchs have stepped in, and Berlusconi called them the kings of state contracts. They win all these contracts. For example, the $4 billion bridge that